So I'm inviting Mr. Per Bylund. Mr. Per Bylund, he's a PhD and is assistant professor of entrepreneurship and holds the Records-Johnston Professorship of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. He's a fellow of the Mises Institute in Auburn and associate fellow of the Ratio Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. So he published a column at Entrepreneur magazine and has featured in the Wall Street Journal among other mainstream outlets. Please welcome.
All right, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
No.
No. Is this on? Hello?
Good.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so thank you so much. I hope you're fully caffeinated because I'm not quite as funny as Yuri is. I'm also, don't get me wrong, I'm nowhere close to as boring as Chris Lingle. So this is not going to be torture, okay? So I wanted to start with asking you guys a question. How many of you consider yourselves libertarians? Not even half of you? That's a little odd. Okay, so let me break it to you to start. You do not understand regulations. Because you think regulations are pretty good. And they're not very destructive. And let me show you why, because I'm gonna go through an argument to show you that generally when we talk about regulations, we do not quite understand how immensely destructive they actually are. Okay? So that's why I call this presentation, Even Libertarians Don't Understand How Destructive Regulations Really Are. And that's you guys. Well, me too. So what is it that we do know then? Because in order to talk about what we don't know, we need to first establish what we do know. What we do know is that regulations are destructive. Sure, we know that. We know that regulations limit entrepreneurship. There are fewer opportunities available because some have been regulated away. The opportunities available are less valuable. There's less innovation because there's lesser space for entrepreneurs to innovate in, so to speak. That means we get less economic growth. We get lower standard of living, comparatively speaking. We don't get as rich as we probably would have been had there been no regulations. We know this, right? We also know that we don't like government, and government regulates, so obviously we need to hate regulations too. And then we also know the seen and the unseen, which sort of sets us apart from most others, right? And you might recall Frederick Bastiat and his story about the baker and the seen versus the unseen in every situation. Right? So let's go through that very quickly, and this is something that we do know. Right? So what is seen in Bastiat's story is there's this boy playing with rocks, and he throws one of the rocks through, I think, his father's window or the baker's window. So he destroys the window. And at first people are upset with him, and they do what people usually do. They do this, and they say, "Naughty boy, destroying the baker's window. That's not very nice of you." And then someone, Bastiat tells us, it has always happened, someone says, "Well, this is actually good because now the baker will need to buy a new window." That is new business for the window maker. This is awesome. This is good news. We should cherish this boy and his rocks because he destroyed the window, and let's call him Paul Krugman. Because he understands this type of economics, right? The scene. So this, of course, this leads to more transactions. So the baker buys a new window from the window maker or the glazier. The glazier buys a dress for his wife using the new income that he gets from that additional window that he sells. The boutique owner might buy a new computer from whoever sells computers, and that tech salesman buys flowers, probably for his wife, and so forth. So you have this whole chain of new transactions that happen. Obviously, this is good for the economy, right? Well, not so fast, says Bastiat. This is what we see, but there's also the dimension of what we do not see. And that's what would have happened had the boy not destroyed the window. Right? So you would have had a completely different chain of events where the baker with a window that is intact would have the money and would probably have used that money for something else. So maybe he would have bought a pair of shoes. So the shoemaker would have gotten business instead of the glazier. And the shoemaker, maybe he's really interested in buying pork, so he would have bought pork with that additional income. And the farmer, he buys planks from someone and so forth. So there's this whole other chain of events and transactions that simply do not happen because the boy destroyed the window. Okay, so how do we analyze this? With one chain of events on each side, both the seen and the unseen? Well, one way of doing it that seems sort of intuitive is to sum them all up and talk about, okay, in the seen version, you have all these transactions, how much are they worth? In the unseen, you have all these other transactions, how much are they worth? And then you might compare them somehow. Do we use the market value, perhaps, the prices of these transactions and so forth? Do we sum them up? Do we just take the differences, or how do we do this? This might seem intuitive, but it's actually impossible, as many economists have told us, especially the good ones in the Austrian school. This is really bad analysis, right? So what really matters here is that there's a window that was destroyed. So we lost some value. We know that. Destruction creates a completely different situation. What matters in the market is that people can pursue what they value most, right? That's why we want people to have economic freedom, because they can choose whichever good or service that they value more, and then they're better off, or they wouldn't do it, right? So when this boy destroys the baker's window, what happens is that we get a new situation. The baker before valued a new pair of shoes most highly. After the window is destroyed, the baker values a new window higher than the pair of shoes. So the situation is different, true, but everybody still pursues their most highly valued end. The baker still goes for whatever he values most, which is with the intact window, pair of shoes, with the destroyed window, a new window. In both cases, people do what they value most. That's a pretty good situation, right? So what we have is simply a temporary setback for the baker. The baker loses that window and needs to pursue buying a new window instead of the shoes. He's not happy about it, for sure, but it's also the case that he's still pursuing what he values most. So there's a setback in that value, it's lost, but he can continue doing what he likes most. So he's not really harmed long term, this is a temporary thing. He still chooses his highest value, and everybody else can continue doing the same as well. It still sucks with a broken window, don't get me wrong. Okay, so this is what we don't know, apparently. Regulation is not destruction. So regulation does not go in and destroy a window for someone. That's not what regulations do. So this is a completely different situation. It's not a temporary setback. It's not a destroyed value. It is a prohibition. It is a certain action is outlawed. You're not allowed to pursue a certain end. That's what a regulation actually means. Someone else tells you that you cannot pursue this end. Doesn't matter how much you value it, you're not allowed. That's what a regulation means, right? So the regulation itself does not change our preferences. It's not the broken window so that we say, oh, okay, now what I value most highly is to pursue buying a window instead of the shoes. No. If regulation simply says, oh yeah, you do want this more, but sorry, you can't, so you have to choose something different. And there's a loss in between, right? Because you want to pursue this, that someone says that you cannot, and instead you have to choose something else. So imagine you're not allowed to buy new windows. So the baker, the window gets destroyed by the boy. The baker says, oh no, but my most highly valued end is to get a new window. I'll just need to go for the second most highly valued end, the shoes. And that sucks, because there's a loss, right? There's a loss between the most highly valued end and the second most highly valued end, which he can pursue. Okay, so suddenly we don't have a situation anymore where everyone can maximize their value. Instead, with this regulation, some people who are affected by this regulation need to pursue their second best options. Now this sucks, right? Because they wouldn't choose this if they didn't have to. This is force, this is coercion, this is oppression, right? That's what it really means. Okay, so let's imagine that pork is illegal in this chain of events. So the shoemaker wants to buy pork after he sells his extra pair of shoes, but he cannot, he's not allowed. Okay, so that chain of events does not happen at all, but it would have happened had there been no regulation. So that whole chain of events is gone. Okay, so instead, the shoemaker will need to do something else. He chooses something that he does not value as the most highest end. Okay, so we get a completely different chain of events and different transactions. Different people get income, just like in the seen and the unseen, but for a different reason. This is not because everybody's pursuing their most highly valued ends, but their situation changed. No. Some people are not pursuing their most highly valued ends. That is the difference. Okay? Because he's pursuing something, but he still wants that damn pork. But he cannot, because someone tells him he cannot. Okay? So this is a rather big difference from having something destroyed, a value destroyed. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, every choice that this shoemaker makes after the regulation has been passed and is enforced, every choice, for as long as he values pork the highest, every choice is a loss. Okay? If he values pork higher than everything else, and every time he makes a choice, every time he makes a transaction, every time he buys something, every time he does something, he wants to go for that pork, but daddy government says you're not allowed. That is a loss to him every single time he does something. That's a pretty huge problem for this guy, right? Okay, so as long as he doesn't change his preferences, he still wants the pork. He's losing, comparatively speaking, every time he's doing something. Okay, and this of course changes other things in the economy as well. We get productive inefficiencies. The whole production apparatus in the economy gets directed away from pork because we're not allowed to produce pork anymore. And all those people out there who love pork, they still would want pork, but they're not allowed, which means the producers of pork will stop producing pork and they will start producing something else. They will start producing something else that people value less highly, right? Because they will try to satisfy their consumers still, but they cannot try to pursue their highest valued end, but some other end, which of course then is not as highly valued. And it means that most transactions in the economy are out of whack in a sense. They're not directed towards the highest values of people anymore. Instead, they're trying to satisfy all these other ends that people have, which are completely different. But the whole economy, in a sense, is no longer pursuing what people want most, but it's pursuing something else. They're trying to figure out what people value that is not as highly valued as the pork that they would have produced. Of course, that means that the economy loses its ability to produce towards the highest valued ends as well. Okay, so completely different sets of values are satisfied, which is a huge problem, right? So that is what I just said. This means that eventually people are robbed also of their choices, right? In every situation, they would have chosen pork, and they cannot to begin with, and the economy stops being able to produce this pork, which means the economy is really robbing people of their the choice that they would have made. And this is due to the regulation. This is an implication of the regulation. First, the regulation just strips that choice from you, but it still exists. And then the economy responds. Entrepreneurs, of course, don't continue to produce something that people cannot buy, they're not allowed to buy. Instead, they invest in something else. But the economy loses its ability to satisfy people's most highly valued ends. That's a huge problem. Okay, so let's look at another example just to make this clear. The sweatshop. So how do we usually analyze the sweatshop? Well, we say that there's the seen and the unseen, which sets us apart as libertarians from, well, the other morons, right? So we know the seen, which is what progressives and others are usually talking about in terms of sweatshops. Terrible working conditions, low pay. None of us would ever get a job in a sweatshop if we didn't have to, right? So their solution is for government to step in and make sure that they make $15 an hour producing sneakers for Nike or something. That's the seen, right? Well, the unseen side is what would have happened had there not been this opportunity, right? And that's what we usually point out, that, yeah, it's terrible working in the sweatshop, but what are the alternatives, right? The alternative is usually something very terrible. Something like prostitution or starving to death or toiling in barren fields and things like that. This is hardly better, right? This is terrible. The sweatshops are so much better, and that's what we usually argue. Well, we're missing something here, right? This is the seen and the unseen. Why is it the case that those are the options that people have? Well, that takes us back to the unrealized, as I call it. What we talked about before, with the economy adapting to the regulations in place, losing its ability to satisfy people's wants. Okay, so the question we need to ask is, what would be the case in the economy had there not been any regulatory distortions? So if in the case of the sweatshops, why is it the case that these sweatshops are the best options that these people have? Why is it the case that there's a sweatshop and then prostitution and nothing in between? Obviously, in an open economy, you would have several different choices of similar value. Right? You could choose between two cushy jobs. You can be a college professor or you could be a university professor. Two really cushy jobs. Okay? So how can we figure this out, though? How can we know whether there would be more options in a free economy? How can we say that, well, these people are poor because of the state and things like that? Can we really say that, or is it just libertarian wishful thinking that, yeah, you know, they're just behind us, so if we just give them a little time and let them develop their industries and so forth, then they will have as cushy jobs as we do. Is that it? Well, we already know a whole lot because there are the sweatshops in these economies, right? So obviously, since there are sweatshops, there's no lack of that type of technology in these countries. There's no lack of such capital or capital goods necessary to run a sweatshop, right? There's no lack of labor that is skilled enough for a sweatshop because obviously they're hiring people. There's also no lack of supply chains and support for this type of production and so forth in these countries. There's also no lack of infrastructure or transportation because obviously those sweatshops are there. Those sweatshops have been put in place and they are being run. And they're being run profitably. And they're good options for the people who live there because the other options are so dismal, so really bad. What does this tell us then? Well, this tells us really that had there been no regulations in the situation, obviously someone would be able to step in and say, hey, I have the better sweatshop. I offer you a little more pay or a little better work conditions and so forth, and we would get pretty quickly a Western-style type of economy there. the working conditions would be at least as good for everyone as in the sweatshop, because that's the level that we know that they can they can reach. Okay, so there's something really wrong in a situation where the economy itself provides one option that is so much better than all the other options. That is, the sweatshop is so much better job than all the alternatives, prostitution and so forth. So whenever we see this in an economy, what we should say is, wait a minute, what caused this strange situation? Because if there is free competition and there's free investment and so forth, if the economy actually works as a free market, different employers would offer similar jobs and they would compete for labor. And similarly, they would produce different types of goods that people actually value. So what made this situation that doesn't quite make sense from a competitive point of view, what caused this situation to happen? Well, there are some options. It could be a temporary effect. It could be the case that, yeah, they're just part of the economic development process. So there's this one investment, and then another one will follow up on it and be as good or even better than the first one. And then they will pretty soon reach a higher level. So maybe this was just the first investment. But this doesn't really fit with most of these countries with sweatshops, because they have had sweatshops for decades. How come no one else launches like the fancier sweatshop and hires people? Why is that the case? Obviously something is stopping them, okay? So there are direct regulatory effects. So sure, there are some regulations in place basically giving, say, Nike a monopoly in Thailand, that only Nike can have this sweatshop. So that's why it stands out as this great alternative to the workers. But no one can compete with Nike, which means Nike can keep salaries down and keep work conditions at a worse level than they otherwise would have and so forth. Those regulations exist too. This is just common monopoly type of market, right? But they're also the unrealized. The reason others have not invested, the reason that the economy has not caught up and maybe cannot keep up with this is these artificial chains. So the fact that there are regulations somewhere in the economy completely distorts the investments in some other place in the economy, some other location, meaning that the choices that people have, the options that are available to them become completely different. This emerges simply because pork is outlawed. There is regulation against pork, which means people do completely different things. That means other options emerge as available for people. That's a complete distortion of the economy when people start acting away from pork, both producers and consumers. Which means that we get these really strange situations like in the developing world. So we have a loss of all these options that people would have. All these alternatives that people would have to choose from had they been able to pursue their most highly valued ends. Okay, so let's just sum up here then. And I see the timer is not on.
No, we still have 5 minutes.
Where?
You see the screen?
Yeah.
And then 25 minutes gone, and 5 more left.
Okay, all right. Very colorful. Okay, so the loss of value from regulations is not a temporary setback, as in the case of the window, but instead it's a permanent loss. As long as the regulation is in place and is enforced, people cannot pursue that end. And the economy pretty soon loses its ability to produce that option for people, and instead produces other options. People's preferences are not updated, because as long as regulation is in place, people still like pork. People would still pursue pork had they been allowed. But every choice they make and they want to pick pork, they have to pick something else, and that is a loss to them. Their standard of living is lower every choice. Whereas if you remember the baker losing the window, it sucks, but he can still pursue his most highly valued end. Okay? So what we tend to do as libertarians is to overlook, and I realize this is a hard argument to make when talking about policy, but we tend to overlook the indirect effects and the long-term effects of regulations. It's not destruction. Destruction is great. Well, destruction is not great, but destruction is a temporary setback. And the economy can still satisfy people. People can still pursue their most highly valued ends, even if stuff is destroyed. But with regulation, they cannot. With regulation, you take value away from them. Every damn choice they make, there's a loss. This is a permanent loss for everyone who wants to pursue that end. Okay? And of course, on the production side, this means that the economy loses its ability eventually to produce pork, in my example. But that has repercussions in the rest of the economy too, because all the suppliers to the pork producers, they're going to stop producing theirs as well. And the economy moves away from pork production completely into something else. Something that does not satisfy people's wants as much as pork production would. So the economy is completely distorted compared to what consumers actually want. That's a result of regulation. That's a whole lot worse than simple destruction. I mean, a bomb would be awesome in comparison, right? Okay, so we have to remember that there are plenty of indirect effects and long-term effects from all these regulations. It's simply forcing one option out of the picture from people, and thereby forcing them to not pursue their most highly valued ends. Okay, so that's my argument, briefly and quickly summarized. If you want the whole argument, I'm going to provide a shameless plug here. If you want the whole argument, you should take a look at my book where I supply it and talk about the unrealized opportunities that people would have had we actually had a free economy. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, a question from famous guy in the back.
The boring guy.
Maybe a comment. When you speak of regulation, I think you may make the point a bit better if you talk about the difference between state regulation and regulation that can come through the market. So, I mean, most people, when you say regulation, do think of state regulation, but it's good to remind people that the market actually regulates a lot of behavior, and that is least efficiency gains, whereas state regulation normally doesn't. Yeah.
Right, so regulations that are sort of invented and enforced by the market itself are not regulations that strips anyone of options in the sense that government does. So those are transaction cost reducing, they can be standardization in industry, how to solve conflicts and so forth. Those are enhancements of the economy, really. What I'm talking about is sort of an exogenous, as economists would say, something coming from the outside of the economy that puts a dent in the economy, basically, which is the government regulation. It forces people's behavior to be something different. So that's a good point.
Okay, question from Lee.
Just your pork example. What about the black market? When the pork is illegal, then there's another market.
Sure, there could be. A black market always has higher costs than a white market, so there's a loss there too. I mean, that's really the economy or the market trying to solve the problem caused by government, right? And it's going to be more high cost because it's not what the economy would have done otherwise. So, but if there's huge value in pork, in this example, then you would have a black market for pork production. but it would come with, pork would be sold at higher prices. People would probably not be able to trust the quality of the pork as much as they would have otherwise. So the quality would have been probably lower than it would have been otherwise. So the market finds ways to solve these problems, but those are higher cost problems, because basically the government has placed a big rock in the stream, and yeah, the stream takes ways around the rock, but those are not as efficient ways as if you didn't place the rock there to begin with.
Well, I think you should use that pork thing in China next month, because now the Chinese government regulates pork. Nobody can eat pork or buy pork now, almost.
And you're not talking about pork as in Washington, D.C., you're talking about pigs.
No, because of the disease.
Ah.
I really like this point because it stresses the losses. Not just, oh, you got to do something different, but the huge loss to someone. The point about the broken window, and you're raising the point about Paul Krugman. You did mention Paul Krugman. He's sort of famous for having said that the attack on the 9/11 World Trade Center had a positive lining out to help economic development in New York. This kind of seen versus unseen, or the broken window fallacy, is often used to justify how beneficial war is. I wonder if you could comment. I mean, would you say then that the effect of regulation is the same as the effect of war, by redirecting values from higher values?
Yes, but, and I actually talk about this in the book, that even destruction as huge as war is preferable to regulation. Simply because you can rebuild after a war, but with regulation you do not rebuild. And there's a Swedish economist, I can't recall who it was, but he had a comment on rent control, saying that there are two ways of destroying a city. Either you bomb it, or you enforce rent control. And he said, of the two options, rent control is probably the more effective. Which goes to your question, it answers your question. Assar Lindbeck, yes. Good, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that.